Shelton Moore from the Castro Valley High School Olympian, and today we have Shelton Johnson, Yosemite National Park Ranger. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here, but I'm always here, so thank you for being here.
So, how did you come from Detroit, your homeland, to Yosemite, and what made you stay?
Well, it's a harder question to answer, from Detroit to Yosemite, because that's the arc of my entire career. I think the more pertinent question would be, how did I get from Detroit to working in a national park? And basically, I was in graduate school at the University of Michigan. I was majoring in poetry in a Master of Fine Arts program in poetry. My background is classical music and literature. And I wanted to work in an unusual environment, and I had an opportunity to spend the summer in Yellowstone National Park, and I accepted a job as a dishwasher at the Old Faithful Inn. I was working as a dishwasher because I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, so it seemed specific, but it also gave me the opportunity to have access to wilderness, and not very many African Americans write about the wilderness experience. So I figured that would be a good way to make my mark in literature by writing about something that most people don't write about, but that's something that's also significant.
And what are your roles in Yosemite?
Well, just carrying over from the earlier part of the conversation, that job as a dishwasher ballooned into other positions, and eventually I took a position as a seasonal park ranger in Yellowstone, which is my first park as a ranger and as a park employee. And then inevitably that led me to Yosemite over a few years.
Yeah, and you said you were here for 20 years, and why do you think people enjoy coming here so much?
I think people enjoy coming here because, well, it speaks for itself. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. I think it is the most beautiful place in the world.
Yeah.
It's an iconic park. It's a World Heritage Site. So our visitation averages 5 million people a year. But I think that anyone who has entered Yosemite has had the experience of having Yosemite enter them. It's a sort of environment that kind of reconfigures who you are, or maybe it reveals who you are at a much more profound level. But people wake up in Yosemite because the landscape is not static. It's not something that's just sitting in a painting or in a photograph. It's something that's dynamic. It's in 3 dimensions. You can inhale it, you can touch it, you can feel it. It engages all the senses. And to have that experience of wonder in a space that's not in a book like Alice in Wonderland or the works of C.S. Lewis, but it's something that you can actually inhabit and walk into. When you're growing up, or when you've grown up in places like the inner cities of America, like I did in Detroit, it's not an easy thing to imagine a fantastic environment that's real. And I would say in general, the national parks are fantastic landscapes that are real, that you can actually inhabit.
I see. And I heard you tell many stories here in Yosemite, and one of them being the Buffalo Soldiers. Where did you hear or learn about these Buffalo Soldiers?
Well, I knew about Buffalo Soldiers before I came here, because as an African American who's interested in history and who is also interested in the West, you have to hear about Buffalo Soldiers.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that they were here until I actually spoke with a ranger by the name of Althea Roberson, who was also African American. And she talked about Buffalo Soldiers, but she was the only interpreter really telling that story. And because it was specifically her telling that story, it made me kind of wonder, well, did this story really take place? Because no one else was talking about it. This is how bias works its way out, or doesn't get worked out. And so I did my own research after hearing these stories from Althea, and based my research on what she had already done, and recognized that these soldiers were here for over a 3-year period, 1899, 1903, and 1904. They built the first trail to the top of Mount Whitney, which in 1903 was the highest mountain in the United States, because Alaska was not part of the United States at that point. They built the first usable wagon road into Sequoia's giant forest, which is the most famous grove of giant sequoia in the world. And here in Yosemite in 1904, they built or constructed an arboretum. That arboretum was just a marked nature trail winding its way through a forest with the trees and plants labeled in both English and Latin. Very simplistic in its origins, but that's considered to be the first museum in what would become the national park system. So it just struck me that they did these nationally significant things, but were almost completely forgotten. So that's the foundation of my work, to make what was unknown known, to make what was forgotten remembered.
I I see. But why do you think it's important to spread these stories about these buffalo soldiers?
It's important because most African Americans, at least many African Americans, have no idea of their heritage in our national parks. They think it's something that European Americans do or other people do. They don't think that these environments tell their own stories because we evolved in a culture of separation, not equal, but unequal. Not part of it. I mean, look, when you look at that, most of American history was before the Civil Rights Movement, which really didn't begin in earnest until the 1950s and 1960s. And as a result, we don't just think that we can just go into a space that we've never been to before without doing some research.
Yeah.
How are those people going to treat us? How are they going to look at us? Are we going to be perceived as being not as good as they are? Will they be violent towards us? Those are very real stories in our past, and our collective past, because of slavery. And part of my ancestry is Indian. My grandparents were black Cherokees from Oklahoma. There's Seminole blood on my father's side. So if you're of African and Indian ancestry, you really have to kind of question a new landscape and really kind of look at it and investigate it, because you don't just walk in, because you could be walking into a very bad situation. And growing up in Detroit, I learned all about walking into very bad situations. And the best way to avoid them is before you walk into them. That's right. So, and think of it this way, everyone wants to have a good experience in a national park, or they want to enjoy themselves. But if you are asking an African American to venture into a landscape where they don't know if there are very many African Americans already there's that question of whether or not they're going to be safe. Because Yellowstone's not so much the issue. It's a federal preserve, but Montana, rural Wyoming, rural Idaho, rural America, there could be issues. People might not perceive you as being from there, and therefore may not extend their arms and say, welcome to this environment. And again, with our collective history, going back to essentially Columbus, you don't just hop in a car and drive to Alaska. So because of that history, we really need more of an invitation. We needed an invitation. And in the early years of this country, going back to the national parks with Yellowstone on March 1st, 1872, that's when it was created. Because of that history of separate and unequal, we not getting that invitation, we're waiting for it. So that's why I wrote to Oprah Winfrey and asked her essentially to do what the country hadn't really done, which is issue an invitation to African Americans, letting them know that national parks belong to them. So Oprah came here with Gail in order to surprise me in 2010, but that was what drove that. I wanted her to issue that invitation because at that time the Oprah Winfrey Show was the #1 talk show on the planet. So everyone listened to Oprah. I figured if she said, and as an African American, if she said, I love Yosemite is so beautiful, you should go there too, then other African Americans would go, oh, okay, if she was there, maybe we can do it. President Obama was here in 2016 with his family, and I remember him welcoming me to the White House in 2009, and I remember thinking at the time, here I am at the White House in the seat of power for the United States, and this was built by slave labor.
So, why do you think, or what do you think we should do in order to preserve the nature for our next generation?
Just do what you're doing now.
Just do what we're doing
Using
now?
it. You know, that phrase with exercise, use it or lose it. You know, these parks belong to people, belong to the American people, because Yosemite is a World Heritage Site. It also belongs to the world. But if we don't utilize them, if we don't enjoy them, then they'll fall out of favor. If they fall out of favor, they can be voted out of existence as readily as they were voted into existence. It takes Congress to create a national park. The President of the United States can't create a national park by proclamation. He or she can only create a national monument under the Antiquities Act of 1903. So there are parks that no longer exist because Congress got rid of them. So national parks can be abolished. So if the political winds were blowing in such a way that Yosemite was no longer seen as being relevant, Yellowstone was no longer seen as being relevant, the Grand Canyon was no longer seen as being relevant, they could be voted out of existence. If it had not been set aside in 1890 on October 1st, this would probably be the most exclusive gated community in the United States. So the Rockefellers would be over there, and some other family would be over there, another family would be over there, and which means that it would not belong to America. It would belong to those families, those individuals. But this is a democratic institution, and national parks are a democracy through which you can walk into and breathe the air and touch and feel what really it means to be an American. This is history, made tangible, made real, and that's what's important about it. It's not just a book, it's a place, it's a story, but it's also a world that you can walk into and enjoy.
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah, it was
Thank
great
you so much for
pleasure.
being here, because that's called claiming your inheritance. Any American that's here in Yosemite or any of the national parks, that's essentially what they're doing, is that they're claiming their own inheritance, which means it doesn't matter if you're extremely wealthy or you're very poor. All Americans, if you're an American citizen, you own the national parks. You own America's best idea. And I work for you. Now I turn to the camera.